Fantastic, folks. Let's kick off. Kia ora again, a very warm welcome. Look, today's session is all about climate reporting, and delighted that for a couple of reasons. One, to welcome April Mackenzie and Amelia from the XRD. This follows on from a lot of work happening inside our KiwiSaver and Investment Committee, and the specific working group that Angus, Rob and Lloyd in particular have led. And part of the thinking when we started was to effectively come up with a game plan of lead, not follow, that the FSC should be at the forefront of helping members think about the issues, think through what it means, connecting in with key stakeholders, help to interpret some of the landscape. It is new, it is moving fast, there's a lot of stuff to get your heads around. And that's with everything else that's going on in the world. And so part of this session is really about inviting the XRD to kind of lay out some of the landscape as part of our broader learning and engagement. So with that, a very warm welcome again to April and to Amelia. In terms of how we're going to roll this session, as ever, this is interactive. The more interaction, the better. I think all of us know in Zoom land there's a Q&A button and a conversation button. Feel free to use either or both, and that'll help inform and guide some of the conversation. We will have a little Q&A or discussion at the end of the show. In addition, this is recorded, so we're on the record, and we will be putting this up on our YouTube channel probably into next week. So, folks, with that, thank you for joining us this morning. We're in for a really interesting discussion. I'm going to invite April and Amelia to perhaps introduce themselves and also to introduce what the XRD does. And with that, I'll hand over to you, April and Amelia. Thanks again.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora, Richard. Thank you very much for that introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm April Mackenzie, the Chief Executive of the External Reporting Board. I have with me Amelia. Amelia, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Kia ora koutou. Ko Amelia Sharman aho. My name is Amelia Sharman. I am Director of Climate Standards at the XRB.
So Amelia and I are going to do a bit of switching around here in and out of the conversation. We do really hope that you'll engage and talk to us while we give this presentation. I'm going to give a fairly high level overview, and if Hayley, you can pop to the next slide. I'm going to explain who the External Reporting Board is. We're an independent Crown entity. And you possibly know us for the development of accounting standards, audit and assurance standards. But our mandate is in the throes of being extended, actually. But why do we even exist? What are we here to do? Why do we need these standards that we develop? And our vision is to make sure that, or was to contribute to New Zealand prospering through effective decision-making informed by high quality, credible, integrated reporting. We used to just say financial statements, but this is changing, and integrated reporting is where entities now are going to, into the future, if you're not doing it already voluntarily, report on natural, human, social and financial capitals and their impact, their social license to operate. Why are they here? So today, though, we're going to focus clearly on climate-related disclosures. And the next slide talks a little bit about why disclose. So climate-related disclosures will take Aotearoa New Zealand a step closer to a low-carbon future. And it also makes damn good business sense. I think increasingly those who have ventured into take a closer look at the impact of climate change on their businesses and on their activities are getting a much better sense of how that is going to impact on their strategic planning. Less so in the immediate short term, but certainly if those entities wish to survive out into the medium and long term. And when I talk short, medium, and long term, and this will come up later in the conversation, I don't mean 2, 5, and 10 years. I probably mean 5, 15, and 30. So we need to be changing the way that we think. I know if there are insurance companies on the session today, you'll be going, well, we already think like that. And the exciting thing is that we hope that this consideration of climate change impact on your entity's strategy will make other organisations also think further out into the future. So you get a better understanding of the long term, you will make better informed decisions. And as you know, and no doubt it's part of the reason that you're on the call, there is a mandatory system coming in, a mandatory climate-related disclosure requirement. But if you go ahead as only a compliance exercise, then it's going to cost you a lot of money and you are going to waste a lot of time. It can't be a compliance-only exercise. It must not be. And organisations, hopefully, because this will need to be driven from the top down, be absolutely taken on board by the board of directors and senior management, that this will change the way we think about the future and the way that the world is changing. It's not about being a greenie or being, needing to suddenly change your values, but it does mean that you will be able, with this information, be able to make much better informed decisions about resource allocation. And investors are demanding it. Investors are saying, this is where we're putting our money. And you'll know that, you'll have observed that already from the New Zealand Super Fund and other institutional investors. So the next slide talks a little bit about the bill. So I love this title, the Financial Sector brackets Climate-Related Disclosure and Other Matters close bracket Amendment Bill. It's at second reading stage. It was meant to have that second reading already, but the lockdown has certainly slowed that process down, but is still on track to be finalised by the end of this year and receive royal assent by the end of this year. That bill has come through select committee. There have been some changes, and that bill claims or says it will contribute to shifting investment away from emissions intensive activities and towards low emissions resilient development pathways. I don't know if that will happen, but what I'm excited about is the fact that I know that if entities start thinking about these disclosures and start implementing the processes and the thinking that's got to go with it, they will make better quality decisions. So who's going to have to apply this? Well, we're going to come on to that in a second, but it's going to be certain FMC reporting entities that have higher levels of public accountability, including listed issuers, large banks, large non-bank deposit takers, large insurers, and large managers in respect of managed investment schemes. This disclosure will be aligned to the Taskforce on climate-related financial disclosures. And on the next slide, we see the 4 key areas of that requirement. The TCFD, you're probably familiar with that terminology. If you're not familiar with the thousands of pages of documentation that goes with it, that TCFD came out of the Financial Stability Board, and it was very much focused on banks and insurers and the impact of climate change on their activities and the potential for systemic risk that the lack of attention or lack of pricing of those impacts into the system could give rise to. There were some trillions, it's determined that there's some trillions of dollars worth of assets that are overpriced. because they don't take account of the climate change impact. 4 themes, 11 disclosures under those themes. And the TCFD is written in a very principles-based approach. It was a voluntary regime, and it established the objectives of the disclosure, and also some principles for effective disclosure that should include that anything that's disclosed in one's climate statement represents relevant information. That means no greenwashing. Be specific and complete. Be clear, balanced and understandable. Consistent over time. Comparable among companies within a sector or industry or portfolios. That's going to be one of the tricky ones. Reliable, verifiable and objective, and provided on a timely basis. Well, the Act itself tells us what that timely basis is. Your climate statement is going to be due 4 months after your balance date. So the XRB is going to stick pretty closely to the TCFD. I know you can't read that slide on there, but it's not for reading. It's really just to give you those 4 headings: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets, and tell you there are 11 more detailed disclosures. But we'll stick to this pretty closely, but the devil is going to be in the detail. There is a lot going on internationally, and we will talk about that in a slide that's towards the end of this morning's little update. So who's going to have to apply? Quickly on to the next slide. I mentioned large listed issuers. Large is with a market capitalisation of over 60 million. So that was a change from the original bill. Previously, it was all listed issuers. It's now just large ones. And then large financial organisations. That's where you've got New Zealand billion dollars worth of assets under management, or for insurers, you've got 250 million annual gross premium revenue. So get familiar with the bill and who has to apply it. Interestingly, the bill talks about managers of investment schemes. On the next slide, the reporting or the climate statement is going to be required at fund level. So in this slide, you've got a large manager in the situation would have to prepare climate statements for each fund A, fund B, and fund C. The subsidiary, let's say it was also classified as a large manager under the bill, then it also would need to produce a climate statement. However, large managers can provide the climate statements for each separate fund in a single document. So one document that sets out the separate climate statements for A, B, and C. We're going to have to set that out a little bit more clearly in the standards to try and avoid any confusion. The next slide tells us about the timeline. Interestingly enough, the bill, as soon as it gets royal assent, the part of the legislation that relates to the External Reporting Board goes live. What that does is confirms our mandate to establish these standards and to issue non-binding guidance in the broader ESG space, but that's a separate project. And it also then starts the timeline brewing or bubbling away. So that timeline is critical. The entities that are required to produce a climate statement are required to produce their first climate statement in the first accounting period after the XRB issues a standard. So it's the External Reporting Board that triggers the beginning of the reporting. Though there's a bit of a backstop. If we were twiddling our thumbs, it becomes live in about 3 years. So what are we aiming to do? We're aiming to issue something as soon as the 20th of October on governance and risk management. We're chunking those 4 categories of TCFD into bits We're going to do governance and risk management first and issue that for a month. And it's a discussion document. It's drawing out saying, well, this is our general direction of travel. What do you think? In March 2022, we are planning to issue the strategy and metrics and targets section. That's the harder one, the big issues in there. And then again in July 2022, we're going to issue, our aim is to issue the exposure draft in the formal sense of here is our proposed standard and give you 3 months in which to react. So we're consulting twice. So please engage and engage early. Along with this, we're going to need to develop, I'm calling them transitional provisions. Maybe I shouldn't use the word transition because that gets used in other contexts in the climate space as well. But it's like first-time adopters. It's here's the standard. How should we phase this in? Now, we're not going to get it right first time. And it's not going to be a big bang, right? You know, we're all on. It is going to have to be phased in or brought in stages, but allowing entities that are more mature in this process a clear sense of direction, but then demonstrate a pathway for those entities still beginning out on the process, on the journey. So that's proving a little headache inducing in trying to figure out exactly how we fit this together. How the maturity is from preparers, etc. And that's why hearing from you with questions, ideas, and solutions is going to be pretty critical. If we go on to the next slide, and I'm going to need to speed up.
Sorry to interrupt, April. We've had a question on about the definition of large. So the question is, will the recommendations of Select Committee definitely be adopted, e.g. the exclusion of companies below 60 million market cap?
Well, it's not exclusion. It's above it. It's mandatory. If you're below it, there will be no one prohibiting you from doing it. But it will be, yes, that'll be fixed. We can't change that. Well, unless Parliament changes it. That's our understanding. Do you think that answers the question?
I think so. And one other thing is that, so the Select Committee, the recommendations of Select Committee, the Select Committee cross-party did recommend that the changes go through, even though there were different views on specific changes. So we are expecting that the Select Committee changes are adopted. Yes, there is potential for further changes in the second reading, and we will stay on top of that.
Yep. Great. Thanks, Amelia. And does that answer the other question that's coming in too?
The other question was just about the 3-month consultation period. So to clarify for anyone, so the consultation period is happening between now and July. So we've got the first 2, and then we've got the full 3-month one in July. If we issue in December, April's about to say what the consequences are for reporting.
Okay, so if we issue in December 2022, which is our plan, then your first accounting or reporting period, I shouldn't use the word accounting, the first reporting period is for your accounting period starting immediately. So starting 1 January 2023, which means you will issue your first climate statement by April 2024. You'll be able to issue it. It allows in the bill, if that stays, it's got to be connected to in some way to your annual report. We need to work through a few things as to whether it'll be inside or separate. At least has to have an address that links you from your annual report out to your climate statement. We thought a slightly standalone climate statement might be a good way to start, but whether or not we get really specific on that is not something that we've tackled yet. On the next slide, I'd like to give you a preview of what's going to be in that governance section that we're going to issue on October the 20th for a 1-month reaction. And we'll take that feedback and build it into the exposure draft and then re-release after that as well. So the governance section asks about information on the role of an organisation's board on overseeing climate-related issues, both risks and opportunities, and the role of an organisation's management in assessing and managing those issues. Our standard will include a group of musts. So you're going to must disclose some of these things. I've just got some of the examples up there. So what you have to disclose is going to include how the board and board committees are informed and how often, how they hold management accountable and any performance measures on management, how the board accesses expertise, either it's on the board or it's getting external advice. For management, it's about how management structure climate-related issues into its organisation and processes, and how they're informed about, make decisions and monitor climate-related issues. So there are going to be requirements for you to describe what's happening at the board or governance and senior management level. In the risk, on the next slide, risk management area of the standard focuses on the processes used by an organisation to identify, assess and manage its climate-related risks. This section emphasises processes, including how those processes are integrated into existing risk management structures and processes, rather than the identification of the risks and their impacts. That's covered in the strategy section, which we'll tackle in our March discussion document. But let's have a little chat about risks and opportunities on the next slide. There are two basic types of risks: transitional risks and physical risks. Risks and hazards, XRB needs to be a little bit more careful. I probably should have put a little bit about hazards. There's understandably quite a focus on sea level rise, increased rainfall and storm intensity, and the associated impacts of those risks. I think that's because we're more familiar with them. I'm sure the insurers in the room could list many more hazards. I'm learning about hazards such as marine acidification, warmer oceans, droughts and wildfires. Some of these additional examples are relevant to anyone investing or working in shipping, tourism, agriculture, fishing, aquaculture. So it's about identifying the hazards, being aware of the hazards, identifying the risks associated with them, and then the next stage in the strategy is going to be trying to figure out the impact under various scenarios. And we're going to talk about scenarios in just a second. So it may be useful to look at the summary of the recent National Climate Risk Assessment, NCCRA, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. That's an extensive piece of work, includes a useful, succinct list of the top 10 risks spread across 5 domains: natural environment, human, economy, and built environment and governance. So let's stay on the top of risks and hazards. Transitional risks, they include such things as policy, reputational, market, technology, sometimes also, and I've got to mention, just in case Lloyd's on the webinar, liability risks, your exposure to your board or your entity being sued for not taking enough action soon enough. So that would fall under transitional risks as well. And we've got quite a lot of information, as I understand it, and Amelia will button if I get it wrong, that the Climate Change Commission reports have quite a lot of thoughts and ideas about a pathway that identifies certain transitional risks. Let me talk about scenario analysis on the next slide. I want to tell you about 2 of the challenging topics that we're grappling with. We did the easy bits first. Forgive us for doing so. We did the governance and risk management processes. We've got that document really ready for release on the 20th of October. But while that's happening, we are building capability and working hard to get our head around all the challenges inside the scenario analysis that turns up in the strategy section of the TCFD. So under that strategy section of the TCFD, there's a recommended disclosure that asks an entity to describe the resilience of the organisation's strategy, taking into consideration different climate-related scenarios, including a 2-degree or lower scenario. So what's a scenario? First of all, just in case people aren't so familiar with it, in this case, it's a plausible description of how the future may develop based on a coherent and internally consistent set of assumptions about key driving forces and relationships. Those forces might include technological change or the price of carbon or emissions. But please note, scenarios are neither predictions nor forecasts. They are stories, they are pathways which you should test your strategy against. It's important that you use these scenarios to figure out how your entity might perform under those types of scenarios and what adjustments you need to take. The resilience of your strategy is what we'll call it. So for the XRB, I've set out some of the issues there on that slide. It's a challenge to work out how to incorporate this recommended disclosure into our standard, because remembering in our standard, it will be mandatory. And those of you who've read the bill will be aware there are some pretty significant penalties for directors and management if you don't comply. So we have to make sure that our standard is feasible for users of the standards, you know, the preparers, the reporting entities, you, but they also have to provide decision useful information for the investors. So we have to make sure that what you produce is useful. Otherwise, we all look like a pack of idiots and we've spent a lot of money and gone nowhere. So there are trade-offs to be made here. A key trade-off is between comparability, which would be enhanced if everyone used the same scenario, or the relevance to the specific entity, which may conversely be enhanced by the development of a bespoke entity-specific scenario, or indeed perhaps an industry scenario. So we've got some decisions to make about who should provide the information enabling scenario analysis to occur. Should it be the role of the XRB to develop climate scenarios? I don't think so. Probably not. We don't have the right skills, but someone needs to. Should the XRB specify which pre-existing climate scenarios entities should use? What would that achieve? Or should we specify which climate risk variables should be included in the scenario? Or is there some combination thereof? So we're really looking forward to feedback on that. Interrupt me if I should answer that question, Amelia.
Yeah, I think it's a great question from Jacqueline. So the question is, will these requirements be extended to other entities in the future? If so, will the same requirements apply?
Right. Well, I think that question is, it's a matter for government policy as to who must mandatorily adopt. XRB doesn't have that as part of our remit as to determine exactly who has to apply the standards. I anticipate that it might. I certainly know there's already work started on about extending the regime to perhaps large private companies, but I'm going to call that a rumour, because that's the job for MB and the government. But certainly I am aware, looking at all the submissions that came in on the bill, that there was quite a bit of pushback from listed entities saying, hey, you know, what about large private entities. Amelia, I think you might be aware of some work on large emitters.
Yeah, so the government is doing a whole heap of work in this space about disclosure requirements for various types of entities. As April said, they are, there were a lot of submissions on the bill asking about extending this regime beyond. The government is also looking at how it can capture the emissions of other entities through various other options. There is the adaptation reporting power under the Zero Carbon Act, which does allow the minister or the government to ask questions of large entities, of various entities. And so that's another avenue. One other thing I would say to this question is that, as April said, the standard is that must statement. You must do X, Y, Z. We are aware, for example, in TCFD, there is different guidance for some of these topics, say for financial institutions. There also may be different requirements necessary for different sectors, industry sectors, I mean there. So in what the XRB is doing is, as we look to issue our guidance, we're anticipating at this stage, obviously feedback dependent, that would be quite sector neutral, quite succinct, and based very much on the disclosures. We are looking to issue some supporting guidance around how to achieve those disclosures. And that guidance might bring in some sector-specific aspects. So in that sense, there might be some different understanding of requirements across types of entities, but that would be in the guidance at this stage, we're thinking, rather than in the sector.
Mm-hmm.
We've also had another question, April, on scenario analysis. So maybe we answer that before we go on to the next slide. So the question says, with scenario analysis, how does it work when the proposed scenario changed in terms of comparative reporting? So would the entity be required to re-perform scenario analysis for previous periods?
Oh, okay. Well, that's an excellent question. So that's a comparatives question. We don't know the answer to that one yet, is the honest truth. Prima facie, I'm going to say no and see what Amelia reacts to. Clearly, one doesn't take a scenario, and I suspect it's going to be more than one scenario that people are going to be doing, but let's say we mandate not less, let's say we mandate not less than 2 and not more than 4, because we might not want people overloading their climate statement with all sorts of information. And those are just examples. I'm making that one up, not less than 2 and not more than 4, but just for the purposes of this discussion. And you will need to, as new data arises and you're able to get higher quality data as well, then one would expect one to use and to check the validity of that pathway, of that story. And we believe also you're going to get better and better at this. Would it be backward facing if you change your scenario? Would you have to recalculate? I'm guessing not. You can't hold me to that, but I think it probably wouldn't. But we might require a bit of an explanation as to what's happened, as to why the pathway has changed. Amelia, what's your reaction to that as the technical guru?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. We're definitely looking at comparative analysis around GHG emissions, the accounting of those emissions, because I think that's really interesting to see trends over time. But in terms of re-performing scenario analysis over previous periods, again, I agree with April. I don't think that that's something that, you would re-perform that analysis, but you might actually say, this is how we thought the future would unfold. This is actually how the future has unfolded. How did we perform in terms of where we thought we might be? This is how, how resilient our strategy was. Maybe our strategy wasn't as resilient as we thought. What we're hearing very much is that investors are interested in those narrative disclosures. They want to understand the story of the entity's decision making. But, I wouldn't say that would be re-performing it for a previous period. We've had another question. Oh, sorry, April, you go.
No. I'm just going to talk about data, but I'm happy to answer the question.
So this one is about how long do we think it will take for these disclosure requirements to be extended to local government, councils and council-controlled organisations?
Okay, now is the answer to that one. There are already a number of councils and council-controlled organisations that are going to be caught by this mandatory system. It's anyone who has a listing agreement, and if you're large. So Auckland City Council has got its debt is listed, I believe, so it's caught. At least one of the ports is caught. I can't name them, but we know there are about 5 entities that are, let me call them local government entities that are going to get caught. There are a number of Crown financial institutions that are not caught by the Act, but are caught through a letter of expectation to comply, for want of a better term, with the Act. So there's a letter of expectation that they need to apply our standards as they emerge. I know there are discussions going on at government level as to how and when they extend this to the public sector. Certainly there are already public sector requirements, Amelia can name the Act, that require public sector entities, departments, government agencies to be working in their GHG area and working to zero carbon emissions by 2025. This is
the carbon neutral government program, and so it captures most of central government, but also quite a few other bits of government as well, with the aim that those entities will get to zero carbon by 2025, and that there are some offsetting requirements in terms of the emissions trading scheme. So I think on that question of how it extends, I would just say that I definitely see that emissions awareness is an increasingly critical piece of organisational data. It is as important as understanding, your profit and loss. It's getting to that point. So whilst there may not be direct requirements on all of these entities, very much emissions data is going to be critical. One of the reasons I would say that is, everybody's internal emissions here are actually someone else's emissions along the value chain. So even if you don't have to report your emissions, someone else might be asking that of you in the near future.
Or indeed, we expect, given our audience today, you'll be doing the asking. Just before I move on to the next slide and get on to greenhouse gas measurement and reporting, one of the final things that's really impacting the scenario analysis part of the standard that we're trying to get our heads around is the fact that in New Zealand, we have a very restrictive data regime. So it's unlike other jurisdictions such as USA, UK, and Europe. Climate data is not freely available in New Zealand. So we've got an accessibility issue, but I think also we've got a quality issue and an extension, that's the wrong word, words escape me, how much data we've actually got. The availability is a key factor in how we develop the standard and how we bring in the requirement to do the scenario analysis. So I've been learning all sorts of new words, and I've got no doubt you will be too, all about geospatial mapping and the like. On the next slide, we talk about the other issue that we have built our capability in and are working on narrowing the options that are out there. So you're probably familiar with these terms already, about the scopes of greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1s, all the direct emissions from your entity. For fund managers, that might be pretty low. Scope 2, that's all the indirect emissions. That's typically around electricity and heating. those two, in the scheme of things, are pretty straightforward. It's the Scope 3 ones that are harder. And the big issue for the External Reporting Board in 4 words is how fast and how far. So how fast is how quickly will we require entities to disclose their Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. How quickly will we bring that in? And then how far? So that is how far, and it's typically in the Scope 3 space that the question how far really starts to, rubber meets the road, and that's how far into your value chain do we push into requirement. I can probably give you a bit of a hint, although we haven't written the words yet, that we're aware that getting some Scope 3 data isn't straightforward yet. Increasing numbers of organisations in New Zealand are starting to measure their footprint. Some have got it sorted and have been doing it for a long time, and in fact get assurance over it. They get that number verified. But that's not the rule across the board. So I'm pretty sure we're going to require Scope 1 and pretty quickly, like from day one. We won't likely require comparatives. We won't make you go back and measure them, but we will make you go for, measure them from the first time and forward, and ask you to disclose historical ones if you've got them, because that trending is a big issue. And as Amelia's already mentioned, someone's Scope 1, somebody else's Scope 3, and vice versa. So, Amelia, I always feel that you speak better to this one. We've got some big issues around control. If you control an entity, do you measure its emissions and your emissions? And if so, is that financial control or operating control? Is that like a subsidiary or equity accounting? It's all sorts of questions around that. And we've got some discussions and work happening on that. Do you want to add anything more on that, Amelia, before I flick on to the last couple of things, aware of time?
Sure. So, yeah, I think there are lots and lots of choices about how an entity can put its emissions into these different buckets, and the choices of how it does that make a difference in terms of how someone else sees the emissions. And it also makes a difference. It's all very well and good for everyone to do their emissions voluntarily, and they, come up with these numbers. But if an investor is looking across entity A, B, and C and wants to know, which of these is a more emissions intensive option for me, if the entities have used different methodological approaches, different accounting choices, it's very, very difficult to make those good comparative decisions. So we have some decisions at the XRB to make about how much do we require just disclosure of the choices that an entity may have made in terms of, say, where it's put its emissions into Scope 1, 2, and 3, how it's done that. Or do we prescribe a more fixed set of rules that say you must do it this way to enable better comparability? We're working through those at the moment. The great thing for the XRB is that, as April said, GHG emissions accounting has been done for a really, really long time. We are not, making up the rules. We are just thinking about, of all the rules and options out there, how do we collate those into a format that we think makes sense for a mandatory reporting regime?
Thanks, Amelia. And on to the next slide. Now, there are 4 slides remaining, which I'm going to cover in a minute because they're just to raise your awareness. Many people have asked us and other, what about international developments? How's this all going to fit together? There is an example of international and local things all happening. The XRB is undertaking its best efforts to stay across some of this. But, this is New Zealand and we're a small team and we do not know all of the detail of all of these things, but we are keeping a close eye on the really important things, trying to source the draft standards that are emerging on an international phase. On the next slide, it just talks about how we're trying to engage with groups of people, how the door is open, today's an example of that. What should you be doing now is set out on the next slide, and we've got that in 3 areas: explore, engage, and measure. And if you take nothing away from today, figure out where you are on this journey. So there's a wealth of information already out there. Out of the TCFD, there are thousands of pages of guidance, reports, analysis of who's doing what. So get familiar with it, figure out if you need expert help or whether or not, you know, you've got a group in house that can do it. So engage, we've said get a coalition of the willing. Senior roles, senior sponsors inside your organisation and across your industry. This should not be given to the reporting person who does your financial statements. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just trying to say it's not a one-person job, and it's different from financial statement reporting. I suspect I'm preaching to the converted on that front. So get a group of senior people together and start thinking about what systems and processes your organisation has to have. Get your board up to speed because it needs to be driven from there. And measure. That's the one thing that's relatively straightforward in all of this. Get out there and figure out your footprint, start measuring your greenhouse gas emissions. Even if we, in due course, eliminate some of the options, you know, you'll have well started and you'll have got the processes in place. You'll have got your head around where you need to be gathering this information from. And the last slide, and these will all be issued to you after the event, we've made them available, is how you can follow us on LinkedIn because we make announcements of releases of documents and sessions and events there. Our website can be a little hard to follow, I admit that, but go and have a search and look under extended external reporting. You'll find a bunch of climate stuff there, and write to us and connect. So apologies for taking a little longer, but I hope I'm forgiven because we answered some questions on the way through. It's been a great opportunity and pleasure to talk to the group. And who am I handing over to?
April, that's brilliant. And Amelia, that's brilliant. Really thought-provoking and interesting scan across so many things. Folks, we've got maybe around 10 minutes for a discussion, and delighted to be joined by both Angus Dale-Jones and Rob Sloan, who are co-driving the working group on climate. And maybe there's a whole bunch of questions I got, April and Amelia, but I'll maybe just go to Angus and Rob first, perhaps for their observations on some of the key themes, key responses, not only in your presentation, but things that we've that have been emanating probably over the last 6 to 9 months. Angus, maybe to you first and then to Rob.
Thanks, Richard, and April and Amelia, thank you very much for a really informative presentation. I'd be quite interested to get your reflections on the speed of change and how quickly people need to adapt to it. And perhaps one way of getting those reflections is just thinking about materiality. Materiality had been in that draft legislation and has now dropped out. And so materiality is a ball that you guys catch. But to those people who say this is not material to us, to our business, or it's not material yet, what response would you give?
Thanks for that, Angus. That's an excellent question. And it dropped out of the legislation, the draft bill, in no small part from the prompting of the XRB, which was, if we locked this into the legislation, how on earth can we keep it up to date? How can we develop a system that matures as New Zealand's reporting matures? So to answer your question, one of the clauses that dropped out is if I'm an entity that says, climate change impact on my activities is immaterial. The bill had said you then had to explain that and get that matter assured. So that's gone, but our standard will say to you, come in the front door, do governance, So explain to us how your board has thought about the impact of climate change and what processes you have in place that you've identified the hazards and the risks and opportunities against your strategy. So just explain to us how you've done that. And then if you conclude and demonstrate it's not there's no material impact on your activities, then fine, just explain that to us. So it's going to be shining a light on those who say, no, I'm not, my activities are not impacted by climate change. That said, we're more inclined as we get into this topic to believe that as entities undertake that first bit, they're going to have a story to tell about why and where they're heading. And they may well say, well, actually, there's some benefit in us trying to get our head out and thinking 30 years out, the long term. So that is all going to be tackled inside the standard. Fingers crossed. We write it in a manner you can understand it, and that's where this interaction is really important. Double materiality is a term that's bandied around. We're avoiding that a bit at the moment. Double materiality is typically impact on entity, impact of the entity, out back onto the climate. That's on our radar, but we're focused on impact of climate change, TCFD first, because that's the mandatory system, and we think it's mission critical that we at least get something in place that people can have a guide, because that's a really good way for directors to say, look, here is the standard, we've looked at it, we've applied it, here's the rigor we've applied, applied to it in order to manage their exposure to those penalties. Does that answer your question, Andy?
Yes, that's really helpful. Thank you. I've got one further question, then I might hand over to Rob. And that's just on scenarios and the coordination between you and other agencies, Ministry for the Environment, Reserve Bank, and so on, each who have the different fingers in the pie on scenario development. I mean, from an industry point of view, we want to sort of tap into, whoever's driving the work, and, to know that there's some sort of consensus building or people working together would be really helpful. So if you could talk a little bit about that, that'd be helpful.
Amelia, I'd like you to talk to the work we're doing with the RBNZ and the likes.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. I absolutely think that there does need to be kind of more of a catalyst to get some of this happening together, because, there are a lot of bits going on that maybe are not as coordinated as they could be. But we are working very closely with the RBNZ, for example, on the development of their stress testing requirements. As you might know, APRA in Australia, they worked with 5 of their largest banks on a climate vulnerability assessment. This is something that both RBNZ and XRB are looking at very closely. We want to make sure that, for example, around scenario analysis, that we are not asking, that all the climate reporting entities to do something that is different from what the bank is asking a subset of the same organisations to do, and thinking about it differently. There seems to be no benefit to that. The RBNZ is very, very open to engaging. We have a lot of process with them. I will also say, we've got this question in the chat around scenario analysis. So it's internationally for insurers, scenario analysis and even climate change has been primarily focused on property, which I understand, right? It's more tangible. Will the XRB guidance be specific to other lines, e.g. life and health insurers? We are intending to issue sector-specific guidance where it is needed. So if we get feedback from the sector that, yes, you think that there are specifics to that industry, that subset of that industry that needs specific guidance in terms of how it works, we are keen to hear that. We're also really keen on scenario analysis for sectors to get together to think about what that scenario looks like for them. What are their data requirements? What is missing to enable them to make good quality scenarios and scenario analysis, decisions in those when they do that scenario analysis. So we really, really want to hear back up the chain what is going on in your sector. What do you think you need from us?
Awesome. Thanks.
I was just going to pick you, Rob. Sorry.
No, all good. I'm going to hand over to Rob. I'm just mindful of time. So, Rob, either your questions or your kind of observation.
Probably one observation, one question. I think the issue around data comparability is very important because if you are comparing apples with apples, then potentially it'll turn into a wee bit of a pointless exercise. I think that is quite an important point to really pick up on and delve into. I suppose my question actually is, you talk about coalition of the willing, etc., and you've done a few of these presentations as we were discussing previously, which I'd say are very good presentations. How tuned in or prepared do you think your average director, company, and even the industry actually is for this? Do you find there's a lot of maybe talking the talk and not much walking the walk?
Rob, I think that's a rude question to ask of us, and I'm going to kick it straight back to you. I'm kidding, obviously, when I describe it like that. I'm kicking it straight back to you. As the Financial Services Council, you tell me how prepared your members are.
I would say that, well done, very good politician. I would say that again, it's gone to the coalition of willing, that there probably are a number of people who are very in tune with it. But when you delve deeper, there's probably a lot of people who know about it, but aren't as well informed. And with the speed that things are moving, are probably not overly kind of like, they're going to go, 2023, that seems a long way off. But in fact, it's not. And I think there is a lot of people out there who are just currently just maybe listening, but not putting any action plans in place. And that could be a big trip up for them.
Yeah, and that's why the XRB is trying to make itself, despite our size, as available as possible, and working with important umbrella organisations such as the FSC to say, you've got the tools and the connections to assist your members. We're here to help to the extent that we can, but we really do need industry groupings and subgroupings to be getting together. Look, we understand that there reaches a point where information and data is commercially sensitive, but there's one hell of a lot of work that you can be doing collectively to assist, that you'll therefore be able to save overall the amount of effort that you have to do, and then it'll become entity specific. So we just encourage FSC to continue its good work of getting people together, getting the message out.
And that's probably an excellent way to close at 10:29. It feels like the purpose of this, which was to shine the light on what's the XRB doing, who's it connected to, what are some of the key issues, has been really stimulating. April and Amelia, I think Rob's point and question, as cheeky as it may or may not have been, I think is a really useful one, because I think it speaks to the readiness across the sector from all the way from the boardrooms to the front line. And I think part of this process is about helping people come to grips with what are the key issues, what are the key measures, what are the key scenarios, and so on. And who else do we have to work with? So let's treat this as a start of the process and engagement with the XRB. We'll take up your challenge on all those different areas. Thank you for your time, and really appreciate the people on the other end of the line engaging. Lots of great questions. The slides are going to be available really soon. And it's only left for me to wish you all an awesome weekend and tearing down the levels so we can get back to business in a more normal way. So thank you all, and thanks to the XRD team.